Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Neil and Cynthia, for hosting and accommodating us this weekend. Thank you. My soul is cultivated by curiosity. And I have the worldview that life is fun and exciting. And when we are left free, it can be very much like a playground. There's much to explore and discover. And that hidden in the veins of every leaf is mystery, marvel, and the magnificent. And that even the small sounds in the spoken word is filled with story and significance. So today, I want to walk you through a story of my own life. It began with a challenge that I have and many teachers have. I'm sure many parents have as well. It's a story about something that you've all done today. And in fact, it's probably one of the most human things that we do. It's about reading, and it's about the language that we speak, the words we use to communicate our ideas. So I'm going to wonder aloud for a bit, and I invite you to wonder along with me in the spirit of curiosity. Because this was a big challenge in my own life, and I approached it with exceptional curiosity. And I hope that inspires you to be curious in your own lives as well. This is me in one of my classrooms. I had just finished my Montessori teacher training. So I had a classroom of first through third grade, so they're 6 to 9 year olds. And this is the age of reading, right? And children are supposed to be coming to school and learning to read. And not every child knows how to read, as many of you know. And maybe you experienced this yourself as a child. Maybe it was a struggle for you to learn how to read. And I was basically taught in my own teacher training that children learn how to read naturally. It's something that it's just what we do, right? It's just a human thing. And I had a little bit of guidance. I had a few materials here and there. But my overall experience is that they don't. that people actually need to be taught how to read, and it's really not something that's quite so natural. So that was my first big experience. I had this big challenge in front of me. The child in front of me, there were many, that did not know how to read yet. And I was confronted immediately with this question, well, how do we do this, right? I thought they were just supposed to read on their own. And it turns out there's quite an interesting story here. So I asked myself, well, what is natural? Learning to speak is incredibly natural. In fact, we don't teach anyone how to speak. We really don't teach anyone how to recognize words. It's something that we just do. It seems to be part of who we are as humans. And we've been speaking as humans, and our ancestors have been perhaps speaking or mumbling in some fashion for, it's hard to know exactly, but scientists think somewhere between a few 100,000 years to possibly a few million years. So spoken language, about a few million years old. And does anyone know when the first written record appears? First form of writing? Take a guess.
Million years?
6,000 BC.
3,000.
It is not even 6,000 years old.
3,200 BC.
Not even 6,000 years old. That's much closer, right? The beginning of our record is not even 6,000 years old. So that's when we first know that we've started to write these words down. And yet we've been speaking for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So it's not quite so natural. In fact, it's a tremendous triumph and accomplishment to write. Well, what does that involve really? What's the story there? I have the child in front of me, but I'm curious, what's the story, right? Perhaps we can learn something from the story of our ancient ancestors. And it's a discovery heard around the world, really. So here's how it begins. Pictures. People start to write down or draw pictures of the things they see. Concepts, right? And very slowly, these pictures begin to look a bit more symbolic, right? We still kind of recognize that picture there, but then over the years, they become very abstract. And then there's a fantastic discovery here. And this is the key. The great Phoenicians discovered that our words are made of sounds, and that we have little markings, and here it's impressed into clay, that these little markings are the symbols of sounds. And in fact, that's where our language comes from. We have little scribbles that make sounds. We call them letters, right? Letters are the marks of sounds. So this is quite interesting. This is the Phoenician alphabet, or one version of it. And as time went by, different civilizations adopted this alphabet and changed it. Of course, this is the Greek alphabet. And of course, we get the word alphabet from the Greek alpha, beta. And then, of course, the Romans came by and took a few things and modified it as well. So this is quite something, right? And in fact, that picture of the ox that I began with is not just a random. It actually turned into the letter A in many languages that we live. Okay, so we have this huge accomplishment that words are made up of sounds and that we can use little markings to represent those sounds. And of course, that is how we read, isn't it? We've solved it, right? I have this child in front of me. I know how our early ancestors have done it. They discovered something amazing. I must have to teach you the code of what all of these markings mean. And that's really interesting because that's actually not what many people believe. Many people believe that our language is quite arbitrary and strange, and that you really can't sound out words, that they're just too random. And so instead, we have ways to kind of just memorize the shapes of words. These are real images, by the way, that are actually used in classrooms. So people have been taught to just kind of memorize the shape of words. Because, of course, adults don't really sound out words, do we? I mean, maybe. But we just kind of look at words and we just know what they are. That's interesting. So maybe we'll just memorize the shape of the word. After all, we're just using our eyes to read. It must just be a visual thing. And of course, we should just look at the pictures to memorize what those shapes mean. I like Skippy Frog the most. You just skip it. So there's a real question here. How do we actually learn to read? Is it something that's just with our eyes? Is it visual? So I hope you have fun and be curious with me here. I'm going to flash a few words across the screen. There's just going to be one giant word. I'm going to do it very fast, and I just want you to say it out loud as soon as you see it.
Reading.
Reading. You did that exceptionally fast, right? Okay, let's do it again. Different word this time.
Reading.
That's interesting. It looked different, didn't it? Okay, let's do one more.
Writing.
Amazing. You certainly didn't have time to look at each individual letter and make it sound. You just looked at it and you knew. But all the words look different, right? So obviously we can't just use the shape of the letters and memorize that because we have different shapes, right? We have different fonts, we have capital letters, we have lowercase letters, and yet you still knew the words. Okay, so let's really think about this. So scientists have actually discovered what parts of the brain are really activated in reading. And I think a good analogy here is that saying that reading is visual, it's kind of like saying eating is all about using a fork, right? Now, we use a fork, right? And that's how we get the food to our mouths and our digestive system, which does the eating, right? The fork is kind of just the thing that gets the food to where it needs to go. And reading is actually the same way, which is quite shocking to some. So we use our eyes to read, but our eyes are not the thing that's doing the reading. So what is the thing doing the reading? Well, we know that it has to, and this may not be so surprising because you heard my first story about the discovery of writing here, but it's our oral language centers that are activated. We hear when we read in a fashion. We're using our auditory processing to see what sound do those shapes make. That is the key to reading here. And just to kind of play with this a little bit further, do you have to use a fork to eat? You can use a spoon, you can use chopstick, you can
Not in
use
the
fingers, right? Do you have to use your eyes to read?
Audiobooks.
So
No, but that's listening.
I was thinking of Braille, right? You're using your fingers to read in just the same fashion. And in fact, it's actually not such a huge challenge to teach the hard of the seeing and the visual impaired to read, but it's an immense challenge to teach the deaf and hard of hearing. So reading is not visual in the way we think about it. Okay, so reading is not visual, got it. But we still have this burning question, right? I have this child in front of me. I want to teach them to not just be able to pronounce the words, but I want them to know the words, just like all of you just knew it. So how do we read words instantly? And this is quite different from just sounding out a word. So the first key here is that letters make sounds, that letters are the marks of sounds. So we'll just make sure we know what all the marks sound like. That's not so bad. But there's a big gap here. And I want you to be a child for a moment, if you play with me for a second. So I'm going to sound out a word for you, okay? And let's just try to figure out what could be happening here. A, O, I, G, A, T, Apple, owl, egg, allig, eight, alligator, alligator. Oh, alligator. Oh, the animal, right? Why am I struggling so much to connect those sounds with the word that we know? So, reading is really interesting. And for so long, we've been very focused on phonics, as well, some of us have, and we should be. But this presupposes something. If we want to know how to read and blend those sounds together, that presupposes that we know words are made of sounds. And that was that ancient discovery. Well, maybe not ancient, right? 10,000 years. That people first had to discover the words we speak are made of sounds. We cannot just know that letters are the marks of sounds. We have to know that the words we say are made of sounds, completely separate from the marks that are made on a piece of paper. And so we play these games, these sound games, and I'm going to play a few with you here. They're fun. We're going to manipulate, we're going to delete sounds, we're going to change them, we're going to play with sound. So let's do a few things. Say bookcase, but don't say book. Case. Say feet, but don't say feet. Say sleep, but don't say sleep. Leap, sleep, leap. You hear that plosive. We're going to talk about that in a second. Say bread, but don't say r. Bed. Say ghost, but don't say s. Goat. Say jack backwards. Cage. So we play these games. In fact, a fun one is Big Latin, right? If you know Big Latin, you really know the sounds and words, and you know how to change them and manipulate them back and forth. Who knew that Latin actually helps you read? Okay, so we have these children in front of us. They're missing this vital skill of reading, which I won't say why it's vital here, I think you all know. And we have our two big keys. There are more, but this is a great start. That letters are the marks of sounds, and that sounds are composed of words. And the children have to walk this historical path just as our ancestors did. Speaking first, and then showing how each sound has a symbol that matches. And this is a concrete to abstract. Words we know. And we have to listen very closely and be taught that our words are composed of sounds. And we don't often speak in sounds. We don't say at. We just say words, cat. And so there are many things that we have to ignore when we hear individual sounds. Pitch, for instance, the vocal qualities of my voice versus a female's voice versus a lower pitched voice. And many things get very strange when sounds are smushed together, that we have to abstract and ignore differences. Another concrete here is we're going from speech to print. So we have to become masters in sound. There are 44 sounds in English. Now that might be interesting. How many letters are there? So there's a problem, right? There's 44 sounds and only 26 letters, and a few of those letters do some strange things anyway. So if letters are marks of sounds, we have to be very familiar with the sounds in our own language. And this is actually quite fascinating, and children find this incredible and amazing as well. So let's take a look at some of these. We often think of consonants and vowels as letters, like A, E, I, O, U. That's fine, and that's helpful when teaching. But consonants and vowels much more accurately refer to sounds. So what is a consonant sound? Well, it's a sound that involves some kind of constriction. There's something that's getting in the way of the air. Perhaps the air is going through my nose instead. Perhaps the air is going through a little hole that I'm making with my lips or my teeth or my tongue, right? Perhaps my voice box turns on or maybe turns off. So consonant sounds involve some kind of friction, some kind of squeezing or closing to sounds. And the vowels are singing sounds. They're in every syllable, so we cannot say any words without our vowels. And they are always open. There's nothing getting in the way of our sounds at all. So let's take a quick look through some of these. So here I've just picked out a few consonant sounds. And I want to highlight something fascinating that I discovered while looking at things. These are two sounds, and these are called stops or plosives, and that's, you're hearing that at the mic too. I'm blowing out a puff of air. So these plosive stops are going to take a puff of air and blow it out. Right? So if I put my lips together, I make the sound. And if I turn my voice box on, I get its kind of cousin sound. There's nothing different happening in the mouth. The only difference here is that one is vibrating and the other is not. Now that is fascinating because there are a lot of these sounds, and they have these voiced and unvoiced partners. And of course, because they're so similar in the mouth, they're often confused in spelling and confused in reading as well. So this is really fascinating out here. I'm not going to go into it, but I will share a few highlights. That some of these sounds are stops. Big plosive pop of air. Some of these sounds go through our nose. Check this one out. All going through our nose. Yes, we speak with our noses. Some of them, those are interesting nasals. Our fricatives are the ones that have kind of a hissy sound. There's some kind of blockage going through. Just blowing in a hiss of air. So here's some interesting discoveries that we made. We like to have words that have sounds in similar parts of the mouth. So when we look at words like jump. We're making that sound with our lips, and the next sound after is also made with our lips. And again, the next nasal has, send, and then our next one is further in the back of the mouth, or like sing. So that's a really interesting thing. Here's another one that is quite helpful. So we often put the letter S after words to make them plural, right? Bug, bugs, cup, cups, cat, cats. But that S actually changes its sound. So listen, cups, cats. But if I do the word bug, bugs, dog, so the letter S is actually making that sound Z and not S. Why is that? Well, it's because our throats are vibrating before that. So bug, has a vibration. Dog, has vibration as well. And so our S likes to vibrate as well and make the sound Z instead. So fascinating things can be learned just by looking at the sounds of our consonants. But actually most of our confusions come with our vowels. So these vowels are organized by the opening and closing of the mouth, the tongue, the jaw. So E, I, and then the tongue mouth goes back up. O, U. And we have a few different vowel sounds as well. So our vowel sounds are where the tricky part really happens. So okay, we're now masters of sound, right? We know all 44 phonemes. This is interesting, but we had that big problem before, right? That there are 26 letters, 44 sounds. So I did some research, and I actually looked at, how frequent are some of these spellings? How common are some of them? So here's the sound Z. And you might think that, that's the letter Z. And in fact, it's most often made with the letter S. But now you know why. So this is interesting. Okay, let's take a look at another. Here's the sound sh. You might think, that's SH. And actually, it's most frequently made with the letters TI. Fascinating. And a bunch more. Our short vowel sounds, which are not actually shorter, perhaps a story for another day, are very regular. They're often just the letter. So that's helpful and nice, right? It just is spelled with letter I most frequently. And our long vowel sounds are awful because they have all kinds of different patterns. So we're exceptionally curious about the children in front of us who need to learn how to read. We've discovered our two big keys, and we've discovered a vast array of just strange and amazing things that happen with our sounds in the English language. How can we explain this? Well, most words in English can be explained. That's a big revelation that we actually know why things are spelled the way they are. We can figure it out. Part of it is through the sounds here. And a lot of the other explanations come from fascinating diversions in the story of English. So we know that letters represent sounds, so k, at. I know how to spell words like that, right? The positioning of different sounds, especially vowel sounds, change the spelling. So AY in tray is an extremely common letter correspondence. We make the sound A at the end of the word with the letters AY. Extremely common, very regular. Likewise, we wouldn't have a word like pain. We wouldn't have, P-A-Y-N, right? You have it at the end of the word. Conventions, especially when the dictionary was published several times in different places, made all kinds of interesting changes. Because, of course, spelling has not been regular for most of English's history. So the publishers and the writers of dictionaries made some really interesting decisions about what should and shouldn't be, and we continue that today. And of course, spelling conventions aren't the same in America as they are in other places of the world. I'll give you a quick one here. And this is an interesting connection to the Roman alphabet as well. The letters J and I are often interchanged, right? And the letters U and V are often interchanged in a much older text, or perhaps they'll just use V, right? And when dictionary writers sat down, they decided we will not have any words that end in I or J, or U or V. So there are no English words that end in those letters. Now there's one big, there are a few exceptions, of course. These aren't rules, this is not dogma, but they are patterns that exist. The word you, like I, you, right, of course ends in U. And that's the only really English word that we know of. Other words come from different languages, and their spelling conventions match those. Of course, you wasn't always spelled that way either, so that's really interesting. So we have those. Other spelling explanations come from morphology, so meaningful parts of words. So we add a suffix to the end of words to change its meaning, like rainy, rainiest. And we have patterns of meaning here. So we know that the spelling changes, and we can explain that. Other things like music and musician, right? There's a difference in sound, music, musician, but the word music is still in there. And so our language is filled with not just sounds and sound correspondence, but also meaningful parts of words that we know. And of course, when we go to people who are fantastic spellers, and we have spelling bees and things like that, they often ask what's the language of origin, because they need to know what are those root words, what are those morphemes. And the language of origin tells us almost everything else we need to know. So very quickly, I'm not going to walk you through the history of all of English, but in a very short, very short fashion here. Old English is Anglo-Saxon English, and these are almost all of the words we speak in just kind of day-to-day conversations. All the I's, you, me, he, she, the pronouns, the prepositions. And by the way, those words tend to be spelled very strangely. That's interesting. Are different vowel patterns that happen. Plenty of different suffixes and prefixes, mostly suffixes, happen with these Anglo-Saxon Old English words. And the next layer of English came with French. And in fact, here we are today in Charlotte. Of course, that CH is making the sound sh, and we get that from the French. We get the sound zh from the French, like in rouge and treasure and garage and just, and we get the soft C, E, and G from French as well. So justice, CE making the sound s, and plenty others. So French is a huge part of our language, kind of hidden in the background sometimes. Then we have Latin and other Romance languages mixed in there. TI for SH, right? Action, and sh. We get that from Latin, as well as a huge array of words that have prefixes, roots, and suffixes. We get all of that from Latin. Different words for literature and science come from Latin as well. And the last layer is Greek. And we have all kinds of things that we get from Greek. The letters PH making the sound like photosynthesis, and different words for science, mathematics, philosophy, all come from Greek. So, we've been exceptionally curious. We began with children that just need some assistance with reading. And my discovery was that there's a whole world of fantastic, amazing, and interesting, curious things that came about just from going down this path. I learned about the sounds of English, the stories, the histories, and it led me to a discovery I wasn't prepared for, I suppose. I reflected on my journey, and I realized that there's something more important that I had discovered. That wasn't just about English or reading. That our language is not random. Our world is not a strange and unknowable place. That there's reason and explanation hidden if only we look for it. And that it's fascinating and it's a joy to discover. So I realized that when faced with a challenge, my curiosity led me to something that I learn and relearn all the time. And that is that I can discover truths about our world. And through knowing this, our children also discover this as well. Now, there are two statements here. There are truths about our world. They exist. They are out there. Reality is real. Our world is one of reason, of logic. It is understandable. It's one of grandeur. Mystery, challenge, discovery, yes, but it's one we can know. And the other statement here is, I can discover. My mind is capable. I have the capacity to learn and grow. And here, this is the birth of self-esteem. I can make sense of this world. I can. So, to be a Montessori elementary guide means that we have to be enlightened generalists. And at first I thought that just means we have to know a little bit about everything. And that's fun and exciting, and I love that. And it means we have to be kind of a Renaissance man, right? And I was all for that, very exciting. It's definitely a part of who I am. But as I learn more and more and discover and act exceptionally curiously, I realize it means something a tad deeper, I suppose. It's not just that you're interested in everything, or you know a little bit about everything. It means that you have the conviction to know that we are capable, and the certitude of knowing that truth exists, if only we are curious enough. Thank you. I have some time if anyone has any lingering questions or thoughts.
You know that principle you said that the letters in words often are in the same part of your mouth? Is that true in other languages too, do you know?
Yes, it is. I'm not an expert in English or any other language. And it's not fully true in English. We go back and forth in different parts of our mouth as well all the time. That particular example is when two consonant sounds are together, right? And we don't like to go back and forth when we don't have vowels in between them. So when we have like a blend of consonants that are right next to each other, we tend to keep them in the same area. I would imagine that's probably true for other languages as well.
Just curious. I mean, in English, we do have a lot of consonants together.
We do.
More than other languages, yeah.
So would you say the audio component is essential to reading? And if so, how do deaf people learn to read?
They learn a great challenge. It's immensely difficult. And truly, I don't know. It's not my area of expertise. I've known teachers who have had, who have done that work before, and it involves things that you wouldn't think of, like positioning, like physically positioning their mouths so they know what it feels like. And that's, you know, we don't normally have to do things like that because we know what it feels like and we know what it looks like. With young children, we actually do have mirrors that we use, just this is for children who can hear. We have mirrors that we use and we point out articulatory features of what's going on in the mouth. And I gave one big one to you, what's going on in the throat, whether it's voiced or whether it's not voiced. So those are big keys. But if you can't hear that, you have to do extra work of knowing what things feel like, even though you can't hear them. I think it's extraordinarily difficult. They have their own way of doing things because it is such a challenge. One kind of interesting thing about Helen Keller, she, of course, grew to become an incredible reader and writer, with challenge and difficulty. And one of the reasons, of course, with a tremendous amount of work and tremendous support, but one of the reasons is she did not go deaf until she was
18 months.
18 months, is that it? Yeah, I was gonna say 2. It's definitely somewhere around there. She at least had a foundation of being able to hear sounds. And without that, she may not have been able to do anything that she did. Yeah.
So has there been a big innovation in teaching how to read in the last 50 years? What were those big things, if any?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So especially in America, we've had our ups and downs of teaching reading. You can see the Dick and Jane book in the poster over there, right? And that's a perfect example of how reading has been taught and still is taught in many ways. That we look at the picture, we memorize the word, we just repeat it. You don't focus on the sound correspondence and what sound the letters are making. So there's been movements in America to move away from phonics, to focus much more on reading comprehension, to understand the ideas of text, and they use strategies like the ones I showed you before. It's skipping over words, asking for help, looking at the pictures, things that completely detract from the actual process of decoding and reading. So the science of reading is good. There is a strong movement today to move towards phonics instruction and the science of reading. There is a tremendous body of evidence that points to phonics and everything I showed you here, and that is getting to schools more and more. And I think parents have played a big role in this as well. It's something that the science of reading has known with certainty that this is how children know how to read and this is how they don't. And I think parents in some level know that too. So changes, I think the changes for the better here. Things are definitely looking up.
So I've known about linguistics and this kind of stuff ever since I was a kid. I've always been fascinated by it. But it wasn't until this talk and the things you were saying that it occurred to me that the idea of a word must have come first, and only after that, the idea of a letter.
Yes. I think the principle here is, a pedagogical principle is speech to print, right? It's the spoken first, then it's, well, how do we write this down? What markings are we used to represent this? And more philosophically, these are concepts that we've had and we know about, right? To express that in writing was a tremendous achievement, and I think that we ignore that, right? Anyway, I started my talk by saying, I'm curious about things, but I am. And when I hear little sounds, it drives my girlfriend nuts because she's like, "Stop pointing out these different accents." And what they're saying. But it's interesting. It's fascinating. Like these are important things. But yeah, I definitely hit it.
Well, that's wow.
I'm also happy to take questions about Montessori and education in general. Part of what I do now is do curriculum development for higher ground education, and I also work with a teacher training in the elementary classrooms that we have. We have over 100 Montessori schools in the nation here and several abroad as well. Although I don't know when we stop, so.
For what's called speed readers, do you know if there's any essential characteristic that differentiates them from non-speed readers?
I've looked into speed reading. No, there's no big difference. There are techniques that they use to help. So one is vocalization, that this is something that children need. They need to hear the sound in their head. So when you're reading a word, if you read out loud in your mind, perhaps, that's kind of you vocalizing the text, right? And it limits your reading speed to how fast you can pronounce it. But you may just be pronouncing it in your head, if that makes sense, right? So speed readers do a really good job of getting rid of that. So they'll listen to music while they read, you can chew gum while you read, and that helps limit the vocalization. At first it's quite difficult to do because you're so used to hearing it, and they're very good at getting rid of that. So that's one great way to speed up your reading. Another is to different ways to kind of track things and chunk things. So instead of moving your eyes from each word to word, they instead try to use the peripheral vision and gather chunks of words to read instantly. So, and I think it's important here that those skills are exactly the opposite of what young readers need, right? Young children need to hear it because that's what it's based off of. When you get really good, you can kind of get rid of that somehow. But it's because you memorized the strings of letters so quickly, and you know how to read words instantaneously that you can do that. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.